hopefully you're intrigued by the subject matter of the talk. And if you are intrigued, I thought maybe I'd just give you a bit of a sort of genesis of where this is coming from. So sometime early last year, last springtime probably, Saravantu, who's the chair of the Shrewsbury group, asked me if I'd give a talk to the group. So I agreed to do that. And so I decided to do a talk on forgiveness, because it's my thing. And so in the course of writing this talk, my chronology might get slightly hazy here, but anyway, in the course of writing the talk, or putting this talk together, I suddenly just found myself thinking, there's a book here. So I did sort of perhaps a bit rather more background reading for the talk than I might have done. And so what part of my background reading or research, if you can call it that, was I did the inevitable Google search, which is a quite simple one, Buddhism and forgiveness. So I was somewhat surprised when about 3 or 4 lines down, there was a line that said, forgiveness is not Buddhist. And so this was the heading of an article in the Buddhist magazine Tricycle about 4 years ago. And it was by someone called Ken MacLeod, who I think at that time, as far as I'm aware, was a teacher in the Kagyu tradition. He's an Englishman, but I think he was living in the States and was a teacher in the Kagyu tradition. So his view, there were 4 different reasons why he considered that forgiveness was not Buddhist. All of which I sort of object to, as you might imagine. One of them was he felt that forgiveness undermined karma. So that's why karma is in the subject line of the talk this evening. So yes, so that was that. So yeah, so anyway, when I eventually gave the talk to the Shrewsbury group, for reasons of time and complexity, I actually left that whole section to do with karma out. So when Maitrisara asked me if I'd do a talk in this particular series, and I said I'd do something on forgiveness, so I thought, well, actually, I'll frame it more, because it's a part that I'd sort of done some preparation for. I'd frame the talk a bit more around karma. So that's going to be a part of the talk this evening. The other thing that happened, I'll say this now, is I was aware last year that there was some years ago in Tree Ratner, we used to have a publication called Dharma Life that people a bit longer in the Tree Ratner tooth will no doubt remember. And I had a memory that there was an article in there which I thought might well be worth my while following up, but I couldn't remember who it was by. Anyway, so I emailed the by now ex-editor Vishwapani, and eventually he put me on to this book, which you probably can't see from there, but it's called If You Sit Very Still, which is neither a manual on meditation nor an instruction as to how to bring up children. It's a sort of autobiographical work. I'll explain a bit more shortly, but it's actually half a stanza. The full stanza is, if you sit very still, you can hear the sun move. So I'll just repeat, if you sit very still, you can hear the sun move. And I'll explain in a wee bit where that comes from. The reason I'm introducing that, well, I'm going to start off with a sort of personal story. And it's possible one or two of you might have heard the story before. So if you have slight apologies, but I'm going to put a different coloration on part of the story as a result of having read the book. That'll make sense as we go. So I'm going to take you back in time 20 years to start with, when I'm living in Oxford, as Tash pointed out, I was probably was the Oxford Buddhist Centre. At that time, I was also working for a small local council just outside Oxford. And it's a sort of job that's a job for life. I mean, if I hadn't left, I could still be working there now. It's, you know, it's like, as long as the council exists, the job exists. And as long as you don't foul up, you know, you're there for as long as you want to be. Anyway, 2002, having got off to quite a good start, I had a big birthday party at the beginning of the year. I'll leave it to your imagination as to which birthday that might have been, and a nice holiday in Goa for a couple of weeks. But I found myself early, I think it must have been springtime, there was an incident at work, quite an innocuous incident in a way, but I found myself thinking something which I realised meant I didn't want to stay in this job any longer. And it was nothing to do with the people I work with. We were all good friends. They'd come to my party, you know, and we've been working together for several years. I got quite a lot of pressure put on me to stay on, but I was quite adamant. I didn't know quite what I was going to do, but I decided it was time to move on. I've been there about 8 years by this time. So after quite a bit of reflection, I mean, I think I assumed what I would do was actually teach meditation, because it's this time that mindfulness and meditation were becoming quite popular in the world and within Tree right now. But anyway, I sort of didn't leave straight away. I decided to sort of just to let the idea sort of mature and talk to some friends as well. Anyway, late in 2002, I eventually got round to resigning, and at this point, everything sort of fell apart. Quite interestingly. For the first time in my life, I got, in a way, quite seriously ill. The immediate illness was quite, in a way, quite innocuous, but the symptom was quite really unpleasant. I had sciatica, basically. I remember when I was talking to my sister-in-law some years later, she said she'd had sciatica. She's got 3 children, and she equated it to the equivalent to childbirth. So you can tell sciatica is quite a big pain, but the cause was quite innocuous, if that makes sense. Other things happened almost exactly at the same time, or almost going on at the same time even. Maitrasara's mother was actually getting quite dangerously ill. And my father, in his infinite wisdom, decided to sell the family house up in Norfolk. And that both those things coincide. Maitrasara's mother then died a few months later, and the house went up for sale. So it was like and so I was no longer working. We'd had the whole grief thing with Maitrasara's mum, etc., etc. So it's quite a tricky time. So I was interested in mindfulness, and I started reading John Kabat-Zinn, and his sort of famous book, what's it called? Catastrophe, and which is very much about mindfulness meditation teaching. So it's quite a thick tome, but I was intrigued that on virtually every page he talks about mindfulness, but he doesn't talk about metta or maitri, loving kindness. So one of the things that happened was that I was planning on doing a long solitary retreat, which I'd had to cancel because all the other things going on. So eventually I managed to do my solitary retreat a couple of years later up at Dhanakosha. And so what I did, I sort of devised my own meditation practice, I suppose, what I consider my own meditation practice. And to start with, I was just revisiting the physicality of that sciatic pain. In fact, when I first arrived, I was literally meditating on my back, because I couldn't sit in a lotus position or on the floor. So which is slightly trickier when you're about 3 or 4 miles up a distant Scottish valley and quite a long way from. Anyway, that's another story. But then it sort of gradually spread, and I started trying to extend loving kindness to other aspects of my experience, other painful aspects of my experience. And eventually, I just everything that happened in my life that I could recall where I've experienced pain or where I might have inflicted pain on anybody else, developing loving kindness towards that. Basically, the term I used was enfolding. It's almost like, sort of cradling it in loving kindness. And it was out of that I suddenly had this realization, this was on the retreat itself, that what I wanted to do was work in something to do with forgiveness and reconciliation. And in a way, that's why I sort of left it from a sort of spiritual point of view, I guess. I mean, what happened afterwards, I did various trainings, and I ended up, I worked for a while for the Oxfordshire Youth Offending Team as a referral order panel leader, and then joined the probation service as a professional restorative justice worker, and was also a prison chaplain, a couple of prisons near Oxford. So this was my working out in more practical terms of my aspiration for forgiveness and reconciliation. And I hadn't really thought very much more about how that had all worked until last year when I read this book. And so what happened? Let's find my place. So Marion Partington is, she's about 4 years older than myself. And she lived originally in the Western Cotswolds, I suppose you'd say, with her family. I think they were probably a slightly down at Hills middle-class family. And she had a sister, Lucy, who was 4 years younger, almost exactly the same age as myself. And they were very close. They were very different, but they were also very close. And then 2 days after Christmas, 1973, for those of you who are old enough to remember, probably not many of you, there was in this country, we had what was called the 3-day week. It should occur to you if I remember this. We had one of our infamous sort of coal mining strikes. And so there was a complete and utter power shortage. And so the government response to this was to put us all on, well, most people under a 3-day week. Some of us were in protected industries or work, such as myself. So that we weren't affected in that way. Anyway, just to give you a bit of historical context. But 2 days after Christmas, 1973, Lucy, Marion's sister, went to visit a friend in Cheltenham. And she left in the sort of late evening to catch the bus home at 10:15 and was never seen again. So I'll just leave that with you for a few moments, because I find it quite, I've read the story and related it a few times, but it always sort of makes me catch a bit. So you have to imagine there's Marion, who's very close to her sister, and her sister's just gone off for the evening and has just disappeared. And is never ever seen again. Well, not for 20 years anyway. And almost exactly 20 years later, I wasn't really following the news particularly at this time, but there was a big, I don't know how you describe it really, but there was a big thing because the whole horror of Gloucester, Cromwell Street, Gloucester, emerged. And so it emerged that Lucy was one of the worst victims. And so there was a lot of other problems with that for Marion. I think Fred West initially, and Rosemary West has never, to my knowledge, has never ever admitted she was involved in the goings on. Fred West initially said he was innocent, or certainly in relation to Lucy. And that meant that her remains couldn't be taken back to the family for burial, basically. So on top of all, for 20 years of not knowing, then the horror, and then not being able to bury her for another year until after Fred West committed suicide. And then the pack of journalists looking for really nasty stories, and the horror of the trial, Rosemary West's trial. I'll leave you with it, where that might have left Marion. I think eventually what happened, she probably had a sort of breakdown, and she certainly had. In the book she says she had pneumonia, but during her pneumonia, and this is the key point for this evening, she had this reflection. She was, at this time, she was a psychotherapist. She said to herself, physician, heal yourself. Do what love requires of you. And then eventually she forgave the Wests for what they'd done to her sister Lucy. She actually wrote to Rosemary West in prison, forgiving her. But I think when I read that, I made a connection with my own story, and I realized one of the keys from what had happened for me personally, I'd sort of gone on a much lesser scale. I'd gone through a sort of similar process, this sort of developing loving kindness and addressing all the different painful issues in my life had sort of led to this whole aspiration for forgiveness. And with Marion, because she had a very specific object for forgiveness, that emerged in terms of her relationship, as it were, with the Wests. Interesting enough, she also eventually was doing restorative justice work and prison visiting, I think mainly in Canada, not this country. So, one thing I really want to emphasize, I think, is like, in a way, that forgiveness, I think my current thinking about forgiveness is that it arises in dependence on loving kindness for oneself. And actually, forgiveness is as much, if not more, to do with the person who's been harmed as it is just the person who's perpetrated that harm. So I just say that again, that forgiveness is perhaps more to do for the person who's been harmed, or the people who've been harmed, as it is for the perpetrator. So I think what's happened for Marion is that she's got these two different processes going on. And she's got the whole horror of what's happened to her sister. And that sort of collides, if you read the book, you see that sort of collides with her own personal history. Because I think, I hope she wouldn't mind me saying this, the impression I get from the book is that she was a bit dissolute as a youngster. She was much more of a child of the sort of 60s than her sister. Her sister was much more straight-laced, whereas I think Marion, being that 4 years older, was very much a child of the 60s, with all that might have entailed. I think there's some evidence of domestic violence as well. So she certainly seems to have had a pretty checkered past. And I think what happened is that the two have sort of, in a sense, have collided. And the expression that I tend to use for this now is burden. And interestingly, I was talking to a Mitra friend recently, and about his history. And I asked him how he felt about it, a sort of unresolved personal history. And he used that very expression. He felt burdened by things that he'd done in the past. So I think part of our work with loving kindness for ourselves is to sort of try and release that burden And in the book I'm writing, I actually give some sort of examples of to sort of illustrate what burdening can look like. And one of them is, I remember 2004, I was in Nepal, and southern Nepal, and watching, it was quite a dangerous thing for these women to do, but they were foraging for firewood, because in that part of Nepal, the only way that you could cook was using firewood. So it meant on a daily basis, they had to go into the local forest to retrieve firewood, which in itself was a pretty dangerous thing to do, because just across the river was a tiger sanctuary. And they weren't even the most dangerous animals. The most dangerous animals which came across into the area that they were foraging in were the rhinos, and the rhinos were pretty big beasts. Anyway, that's a sort of slight aside, but just being there was quite dangerous. But these, you can imagine the women actually carrying these great big packs of logs and twigs. Twigs isn't a strong enough word, is it? You know, sticks and logs on their backs, or bent over, bouncing. And over time, you can imagine how you actually, your whole physical shape becomes the same shape. You know, you just get stuck in that shape. And I think the other thing is, the only way that you can balance your sticks, as it were, on your back, you have to hold them. So, you know, it's a bit like you're always like attached, that they're damaging you physically, but you're having to hold them to get them home. So I think, you know, burdening is like that. We hold on. It's sort of almost like illogically, in a sense, we hold on to our past. We can't let go. It's interesting that there's actually a Buddhist sutra, it's quite a short sutra, called the Bhara Sutra, B-H-A-R-A. And Bhara means burden. So the Buddha's giving a very short discourse on the burden. And one of the burdens he suggests is attachment to the skandhas, you know, our whole sort of psychophysical being. And slightly later on, he gives a sort of verse version where he says, it actually was even deeper. It's just the burden is the skandhas themselves. But maybe for the time being, we just might consider that actually how we burden ourselves by being attached to our past and things that we might have done or had done to us. So, yeah, so I'd like to, so I sort of think forgiveness is as much about forgiving our past and things that have happened to us as it is forgiving anybody who might have harmed us. Yeah, so self-metta, self-maitri, I would suggest leads, or certainly forgiveness potentially arises in dependence on self-metta. One time, I haven't got to calm here. So I'm going to cut a bit here because I want to go back to what Tash was saying. I think she seems quite keen on me talking about the Dhammapada. So having said that, Mr. MacLeod has said that forgiveness is not Buddhist. One of the intriguing things about forgiveness is I just don't think it really is mentioned that much in Buddhist teaching. A friend of mine in Oxford who's pretty adept at doing very rapid surveys of the Pali Canon did a survey for me and came up with not anything that actually corresponds to forgiveness in the sense that I'm using it and the way that we would normally understand it. And then I think almost like literally a couple of weeks ago, I was in dialogue, a very short dialogue with an order member called Divan. Some of you, or should occur to you will know Divan, but who's up in, I think it's in Chester now, but he's a Pali scholar. What I didn't know was that he seems to have done a translation of the Dhammapada. And so he came back at me with a verse from the Dhammapada, verse 184. which he now translates as patient forgiveness. Patient forgiveness is the ultimate austerity. That's the first line of the stanza. And the term that translates as forgiveness, titika, I hope that's correctly pronounced, it's T-I-T-I double K-H-A, titika, actually is usually translated in terms of endurance or forbearance. So I sort of quizzed him a bit, well, why have you chosen forgiveness? And so I found it quite, actually I looked up in my own Pali dictionary, and true enough, we look up this word if you know how to do it in a Pali dictionary, and it says endurance, forbearance, forgiveness. So I thought, well, that's interesting, isn't it? So I wrote back to him, I said, well, actually, endurance and forbearance, actually, that in English, they're quite passive words. It's like something that happens to you, you endure it or you forbear. But forgiveness is actually quite an active thing. You really have to go out to forgive somebody. If someone's really hurt you, then you really have to go out of your way to forgive them. So it's quite an active way. And he came back and says, well, quite, and in the context, so the Buddha is saying, and as far as I'm aware, the Dhammapada is one of the, in terms of the Pali language, seems to be sort of quite early, as far as we know. As far as we can tell, the Dhammapada represents a collection of teachings which are historically or chronologically closer to the historical Buddha. And the verses are structured differently from most Buddha sutras. So in the first line, the Buddha says, patient forgiveness is the ultimate austerity. So what more can you do but practice forgiveness? It's like the ultimate. It's almost equating it with enlightenment, I would suggest. So what I'm hazarding in my writing is that actually there's almost like a process not linear process, but like a spectrum of responses or reactions to harm. And it begins at one level with endurance. You actually just put up with something. Forbear is a bit more positive, but forgiveness is actually actively, positively engaging with harm and going out and more importantly, letting go. Because if you can't let go if you've been harmed and you don't let go, you can't really relate in a constructive way with the person who's harmed you. So not only are you holding yourself in a fixed manner, in a way that the wood foragers would end up in a fixed posture, psychologically, emotionally, you're ending up in a fixed way as well. So I think, being able to develop loving kindness towards yourself, to be able to forgive yourself, starts to relinquish that burden. And when you can start to relinquish that particular burden, you can start to see and relate to the person who's harmed you in a very different way. And if you don't do so, the danger is, in a way, that you actually restrict them, you limit them to the person who's harmed you. You can only see them, you sometimes use the metaphor of spectacles, coloured spectacles. You have a harmed coloured spectacle that you view somebody with. If you can forgive them, you start replacing them with a much broader lens. You start seeing somebody as a much more whole human being. And I think that allows them to be able to move on themselves. Because if everybody just relates to them as being a harmer, a perpetrator of harm, it's almost like they're almost forced into that sort of role, if that makes sense. You can't be too literal about it, but if someone's always relating to you as being a harmer, you're more likely to harm. If someone relates to you in a really kindly way, you're more likely to respond kindly. I mean, it's sort of, in a way, sort of fairly basic, sort of amateur psychology in a way. But so I think it's just really important to be able to respond to people quite positively. And yeah, so I think the danger is that if someone who perpetrates harm can't move on, if they've got any conscience, and I think the way I tend to view, I'm going to be quite brief here, I think if they've got any real conscience, the way that the karma works, if you can use that term, it's a slightly imprecise term, because actually karma means action. It doesn't really mean effect, it means action. So in Triratna, we usually talk about karma vipaka as being the result of an action. And there's another term which I'm sort of tending to prefer myself, which is phala, P-H-A-L-A, which seems to mean almost exactly the same thing as vipaka, but it's a more metaphorical term. And it means, metaphorically, it means more like fruit, whereas I think vipaka means more strictly result. Phala means fruit. So I find that a really interesting term, because it's a bit like somebody does something and it bears fruit. And if the conditions are there, that fruit is then going to bear, it will sort of plant itself in the ground, as it were, and it will become a bush or shrub or whatever, and it will bear more fruit. So it's a bit like the whole vicious cycle just continues. That person is just basically trapped in a cycle, in a way that we talk about the wheel of life. I think, you just get, a person can just get trapped in that whole way of actually hurting, feeling terribly guilty, but actually the whole world is coloured. The whole way they perceive the world is coloured by their actions, and that actually they end up actually acting in a similar manner again. So I think the compassionate way forward is to really try and engage with somebody in the way that sort of restorative justice can do, and relating to people as a human being, not as an offender, not as a harmer or perpetrator, and allowing them to sort of to see your humanity and to actually realize that actually they've got their own humanity, and it allows them to start breaking out of that vicious cycle, and entering into a more positive mode of conditionality. In changing the sort of frame of reference, just very rapidly, just to conclude, pretty well. So in Buddhism, we talk about, there's a couple of terms we use called Hri and Apatrapya. So one might say these are the positive Buddhist counterparts of sort of wallowing guilt, if you like. So the sort of samsaric way is samsaric guilt. The positive spiritual way from a Buddhist point of view is Hri and Apatrapya. And Hri can sometimes be slightly crudely translated as being shame. It's a bit like you've fallen short of your own ethical standards. Apatrapya is when you realize, either because someone points out to you, or because in reference to people you respect, you realize you've fallen short of ethical standards in their eyes, and actually you really regret that. I think Subhuti refers to it as more like reverential shame. And that's, from a Buddhist point of view, although they're quite painful experiences, they are quite positive spiritual experiences. And in themselves, they can lead on to positive spiritual development. In fact, there is at least one sutra, I think in the Anguttara Nikaya, which actually, the Pali equivalent is Hira-ottappa. So there's actually a whole sequence of Paticca-samuppada dependent arising, which starts with Hira-ottappa, that recognition that you've fouled up from an ethical standard, actually potentially sort of starts putting you onto the spiritual path. So I'd suggest one of the hands, going back to Avalokiteshvara, which is our theme for the year, I think, is actually, maybe we can imagine one of the hands of Avalokiteshvara actually reaching out to both people who've been harmed and people who've harmed, and actually getting them to drop the burden of that harm, drop the burden of all the painful experiences. You don't forget, but actually just dropping that emotional, psychological baggage and allowing people who've harmed to actually be able to see the import of what they've done and be able to move on and put that behind them and act ethically. And just for Tasha's benefit, we'll read verse 184 again. So according to Divan, the translation is, patient forgiveness is the ultimate austerity. The Buddhists say that nirvana is the ultimate. A renunciant does not harm another person.